friends, welcome to the Safer and Stronger podcast. I am Kara Kelley. I'm the CEO of Clinical HR, and this is Duane Tinker, CEO of Dental Compliance Specialist. Duane, I am so excited to get to do this with you today. This has been a vision of ours for the last couple of months, it seems now.
Yeah. So you know what? It's funny how this whole thing, this Safer and Stronger Learning Lab came about was just the two of us just talking about issues that we deal with and support our clients with. And, we both work in a compliance space. You work in HR, I work in other compliance areas, and we both deal with clients that we're finding are just ill-equipped to be able to handle issues with, internal conflict with between the doctors and staff, with difficult patients, and we're seeing what seems to be an increase in threats and violence against medical and dental professionals, kind of nationwide. And since we're supporting our clients with these issues, there's opportunity there.
There has, and this isn't new, honestly. I mean, yes, there may be some newer headlines about incidents that end in fatalities or incidents of violence against dental professionals from patients, but quite honestly, there have been employees that have dealt with domestic violence situations that myself as the HR professional, the HR advisor, have dealt with for the last 10 years, really since I started doing this. Stories of one of the employees' boyfriends that had abused them at home and they came to work, and how they feel from that end. And so, I mean, this is really not new, but it is definitely critical, and I really feel like it's not been talked about.
I 100% agree. And I think some of what I'm hearing from people is they don't know how to deal with these potentially violent situations. I'm hearing from doctors and staff that they're afraid of getting negative reviews, or afraid of having to deal with the state board complaint. And, they're afraid of rocking the boat. But on the other hand, they're also scared. And some people are just afraid of conflict and they're not sure what to do. And I'm like, it seems so obvious to me, but it's apparently not obvious to some people. And looking at it from their point of view, I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, when we were talking a couple of months ago, when we first really conceptualized the whole Safer and Stronger brand, I don't even want to just talk about Learning Lab because, hey, look, this is a podcast now. So within a couple of months, this has really become a brand that we're really wanting to dive deep on and further this mission that we want people to feel physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe and strong at work. When we were talking about that in the very beginning, you had shared about your friends, the dentists that were attacked by a patient that ended in a fatality up in North Texas about a year and a half ago, I guess, at this point. And you were telling me that story, and it really just struck me that this is something that we really need to do. I'd love for you to tell it again. I know we've talked about it personally, and we've talked about it in some of our promotional materials, but I really just, for the people listening today, I'd love for you to go ahead and share that, why this matters and where this really started.
Yeah. So thanks for that opportunity. So in consulting, I had the opportunity to meet and become friends with one of my clients, and we used to go on double dates together with our wives. His name was Dr. Jack Burroughs, and he was a general dentist practicing in Tyler, Texas. And Dr. Burroughs was shot and killed along with his partner, Dr. Blake Sinclair, in March of 2022, so 2 years ago. And it was a deal with the situation with the patient who was just upset, unhappy with the outcome of his whatever treatment it was, and felt that the only option he had to deal with it was to just, commit violence. And so it kind of struck me on a personal level there, losing a personal friend like that. And I feel like, kind of the best way that I can honor Jack's memory is to share the knowledge and skills that I have to help make dental offices safer for people, especially considering I seem to be getting more and more and more phone calls from clients going, we don't know what to do. I mean, I was a law enforcement officer for 10 years, and I've done active shooter training, and I've dealt with, I've done hostage negotiation, and, dealt with a lot of situations that required conflict resolution and diffusing difficult situations. And I thought, my gosh, I need to share what I know and do what I can to make a difference.
Let me ask you this. Can you ever really be prepared for that kind of situation?
there's so many ways, so many things that people need to do to be prepared. It's not just even about being physically able, but also being psychologically and even spiritually able. I mean, let's just take, for example, look at an active shooter situation. You've got, your basically your fight or flight response. You're gonna sit there and take it, or you're gonna get beat up. So preparing yourself to potentially fight violence with violence. And when we're talking about healthcare providers who they're not wired that way, they're not wired to commit violence, they're not wired to commit acts of aggression. Not that they're incapable, but it's something that they're not wired for, and they have going into a situation like that. You have to make that decision ahead of time that, hey, if I'm ever faced with a situation like this, I'm going to be a victor, and I'm going to be okay with my God or my higher power, whoever it is that you pray to. And so you've really got to commit to that long before you're ever faced with a situation. And I think that's why understanding that, I think, is why it's so important to me to get out in front of that with people, to help them to understand all that goes on mentally, spiritually, and of course physically, and how we have to respond to these situations, because it's not easy.
No, it's not. And it's not something that you can just take a class on one time and then just magically be prepared. I hear so many stories about even accidents with patients. Like if you're talking preparedness in the sense of emergency medical preparedness, which is something else we're talking about here at Safer and Stronger,
Yeah.
that the team just panics. You have fight or flight, but you also have freeze, fight, flight, or freeze. And
That's right.
they don't know what
Yeah.
to do, even though they've had that training. They may have had it, 6 months before, a year before, 3 years before, depending how often you're doing this. But in the actual emergency situation, I hear teams that just basically leave the room. The patient's having a medical emergency and the doctor is the only one really prepared to handle it because the team just doesn't know what to do, and they just leave the room. So talk about that. Talk about how preparedness really occurs. How do we get prepared, and how can we not just that one time in class, but on an ongoing basis, get ready for any kind of emergency?
Well, Kara, I think you really just hit the nail on the head there. It's not a one-time conversation. It's not just going to a class and learning, but it's that continual conversation, playing the what-if game. When raising my kids, I always played what ifs, through what if scenarios with my kids. Especially since I was a cop and I lived in the community where I worked, that, if something happened, I wanted to be able to separate from my kids without saying, hey, daddy's about to get in a fight, daddy's about to do something. And I actually had a situation like that happen one time, and I was mad that my kids had to see me be violent with somebody. Um, but I think it's something that needs to be discussed over and over and over and over. And, especially seeing that's how people move from office to office. You may have gone to a training, maybe even with the previous office, but have you talked about those things that you talked about at the old office, at the new office? Have you identified the safe places that you might be able to go in the dental practice if things were to go bad? Have you identified, how you're going to respond if you have a patient, or for that matter, even another staff member or an estranged lover or spouse of one of your staff that shows up at the office to commit an act of violence? Have you talked about what to do, where to go, how to respond? What are things that you can use as weapons? And it's got to be talked about over and over and over.
Well, and for some people, that's an uncomfortable conversation, especially when you're talking about domestic violence situations. Some people don't feel able to talk about that at work. They don't feel able to be vulnerable. One of the favorite authors that I have is Chris Moreland, and he has a book called Blind Attraction to Certainty. And in that book, he talks about how people only show up with about 65% of themselves because they don't feel comfortable bringing the rest of themselves to work. And that may be in this situation, maybe, hey, I'm going through a divorce. I have an abusive spouse or abusive partner at home. I'm in that situation, and I don't feel like I can share it until it's too late, until that person does show up at this workplace, at your practice, and causes a violent situation. And so getting comfortable being uncomfortable and having those uncomfortable conversations with your team when necessary, or at the very bare minimum, making them feel safe enough to share those things at work and creating that vulnerable space for that vulnerability-based trust that we all need to have is going to be crucial to making sure that you feel physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe at work.
Yeah, 100%. I've had just the opposite situation where an office has called me and said, look, we have somebody in our ranks that we think is unsafe at home, and we're concerned and we don't know what to do. And I mean, the answer seemed obvious to me, but it didn't seem obvious to them. And my response to them was, why don't you sit down and have a conversation and say, are you okay? But just being available. I mean, that's the first step to, just availing yourself to be of service to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And
That's really important.
I've had similar conversations with some of my clients as well. And I always have to take them through the HR route. Honestly, whenever I talk about these conversations with them, because I'll have clients that call and say, hey, I feel like somebody is not in a safe situation at home. I have their emergency contact. Should I call and let that person know that I'm concerned about them? No, you should talk to the person.
What if that's the person?
What if that's the person?
Right.
What if you're causing something else? What if that's not really going on and the person you've just notified creates another problem that ends very, very badly for your team member? I understand all of that comes from this deep place of concern, but we have to be smart about how we're approaching our team members and smart about what we're doing, the actions that we're taking that could create more of an issue. And part of it is just having that conversation with the team member and feeling brave enough, because it takes courage to have that conversation with anybody, let alone somebody working for you, but being brave enough to have that conversation with them.
Yeah. Well, so a quick teaser here for those of you that are just tuned in here. We're going to create a series of episodes here, and we're going to talk about different aspects of this here. And at some point, we're going to talk about how to handle, what to do in the unthinkable situation of a violent situation. But there's so many things that we have to talk about that can prevent that from happening. Now, we can't possibly read the future or prevent everything, but what we can do is share with you some tricks, some tips, some knowledge, and facilitate discussions between you and your team members on things that you can take to identify when somebody might be violent, how to handle those situations, and identify internal as well as external resources that you can tap into to facilitate these conversations and make stuff happen. We'll talk about how to establish safety plans, how to identify safe areas. We're going to identify some different safety devices that you can use to create a safe room that you can prop yourself into, recognizing that most dental offices don't have a place where your staff members can get to and lock themselves in. So I've done some research to find some products that you guys can use that are like super cheap and super easy to use. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to delve into. You want to give us some other insights?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing we've talked about when we're considering safer and stronger just in general is other types of security for your practice, and other types of security meaning things like your physical wellness. We've talked to some speakers who speak on ergonomics that we would love to invite them onto this podcast and hopefully have them share some of their insights. They're going to be at our learning lab as well, to be able to share those insights in person. But that physical strength, feeling like you are capable of continuing on with the work that you're doing, the work that you're called to do in dentistry, and in healthcare in general, being able to, sit all day, stand all day, sometimes have to be in awkward positions and things of that nature, that we want to make sure that your team feels like they can be physically strong at work and can continue, with their career as long as possible. Because that's another thing that we hear so much of. We hear so many conversations about burnout, and some of it is mental burnout, from dealing with patients and dealing with crisis all the time. But other times it's physical burnout. They just really, truly physically can't do the job anymore.
Can't do the job.
No. And I have a little bit of history with that myself personally. I have a background as a clinical massage therapist, and ergonomics were incredibly important in that field. That's a one that has maybe like a 10-year max lifespan on average for most massage therapists. And so I can imagine how some of our healthcare professionals are dealing with their bodies and how they're having to continue to do what they can to extend their career.
Yeah. And then there's another aspect of the safer and stronger being protecting patient information, implementing stronger security measures there to protect your patients from being violated, from having their privacy violated, from having their identity stolen, from protect the practice, from improper access and improper disclosure of protected health information. So we're going to talk about some cybersecurity stuff. We're also going to talk about medical emergency preparedness. That seems to be a really hot topic here the last several years, as the standards of care for providing competent emergency care when persons in a dental practice, not just patients, but anybody who's in the dental practice has a medical emergency. There, as healthcare providers, dentists and staff need to have some basic competencies. No, they don't need to be paramedics or EMTs, but they need to have some basic competencies to be able to provide competent care so they have a viable patient to hand off to the paramedics, and we positively, as opposed to adversely, impact patient outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this really starts with your team, getting your team in that safer and stronger mindset. Whether it comes to cybersecurity and making sure we're being cautious and safe online, and with the information that we're given from our patients, that is our obligation to protect. You have a duty to protect your patients' healthcare information, their personal information, their financial information. They put a lot of trust in you as a practice. And so it's up to your team to really take that step and make sure that they're handling those things correctly. The other thing on your team, I know whenever we had this conversation, one of the things I found incredibly intriguing is infection control. I've always thought of more of the old school IDC, and we just keep adding more alcohol to the wipes is how we continue to improve our infection control. But there's really a lot more to it. And we've gotten some really modern solutions lately that whenever you started talking about it, I was really, really fascinated by that. I'm kind of excited to explore that a little deeper as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to share that. I went to a conference this last weekend and saw some companies that are coming out with some really innovative stuff. And funny, they're actually based out of Austin.
Oh, nice.
That are coming out with some new sterilizer products that are ultraviolet based as opposed to heat or steam based. And they're working on their FDA approval. There's some really, really cool technology happening in the infection control space. So let's dig into it and learn about it.
Well, and if there's anything that you as a listener want to hear about in the theme of safer and stronger, we'd love to hear that from you. We'd love for you to drop us an email or comment on these posts and tell us what you want to hear. What would help you feel safer and stronger in the workplace, in the practice that you work for?
Absolutely. Our contact information will be in the show notes here. So do us a favor, if you would, reach up and hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast app you're listening to right now. And, bring us a friend, if you would. And we'll see you on the next episode.